Chosen one, you said nothing, but heaven stood up. Trumpets didn't have to sound and fire didn't need to fall, because the silence you carried was already shaking realms. While others were fighting for attention, you were surrendering to alignment. While they ran to the crowd, you ran to the secret place. And in that stillness, something divine happened. You weren't losing, you were listening. You weren't weak, you were being woven, thread by thread, into heaven's strategy. And now, the board has shifted, the game has changed. Heaven just declared checkmate in your name. This isn't just another message. This is prophecy wrapped in reminder. You didn't survive all that fire to stay silent forever, but your silence wasn't empty. It was intercession. It was intelligence. It was heaven's camouflage. If something deep in your spirit just recognized itself in these words, go ahead and drop a 777 in the comments. That's not just a number. It's the sign of heaven's stamp, heaven's completion, heaven's justice. And to all of you who've been sowing seeds into this space through your super thanks, I don't take it lightly. Your support is sacred. It's helping this message flow farther than algorithms ever could. I see your generosity. I feel your agreement. I bless it. Now stay with me, because what I'm about to show you will shift the way you see every battle you didn't fight, every insult you didn't answer, every lie you let pass. You thought you were silent because you were tired, but heaven says you were silent because you were strategic. And now, the tables aren't just turning, they're yours. Let's get into it. God's chosen ones, you said nothing, but heaven just declared checkmate. They thought they had you cornered. They mistook your stillness for weakness, your silence for surrender. But what they failed to discern was that stillness is not stagnation. It is calibration. Like the eye of a storm where pressure balances itself in near perfection, your calm was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of strategy. You weren't immobilized. You were aligned. While they scrambled for visibility, spinning chaos like a spider does silk, you stood in frequency, resonating at a pitch far above their games. Because unlike them, you were never looking for a stage. You were holding a throne. In the book of 2 Chronicles 20:21, when the armies rose against Jehoshaphat, the Lord said, "You will not have to fight this battle. Take up your positions, stand firm, and see the deliverance the Lord will give you." And that's exactly what you did. You stood still, not out of passivity, but because heaven had already declared the outcome. While they launched arrows of provocation, masked as kindness, wrapped in smiles but tipped with venom, you kept your armor on without raising a sword. You saw every passive-aggressive jab, every emotional ambush dressed as concern. You registered their frequencies like seismic waves on spiritual ground. And rather than respond, you recorded. It's the same composure we saw in Jesus during his trial before Pilate, John 19:9. The Son of God, Word made flesh, stood silent as his accusers flailed and barked. That silence wasn't powerlessness, it was dominion. He knew the script, and he knew they were still reading from the wrong page. While they rehearsed their drama, baiting reactions like a magician uses misdirection, you chose precision. This is not a psychological freeze response. This is mastery. Cognitive science calls it executive function under pressure. When the prefrontal cortex overrides the limbic system and selects intention over impulse. You didn't mirror them because you were never meant to reflect dysfunction. You were designed to expose it. And isn't that what Joseph did? Betrayed by brothers, imprisoned unjustly, forgotten by men, but never forgotten by God. Genesis 50:20 captures it perfectly. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph didn't clap back. He elevated, and so did you. While they craved your collapse as proof that their attacks worked, you became the anomaly in their data, the outlier, the silent variable that renders the formula unstable. You didn't retaliate, you recalibrated, like a tectonic plate shifting so subtly yet so powerfully it reroutes rivers and splits landscapes. You moved in silence and the ground underneath them cracked. And here's where the checkmate came in. Without warning, without war, just a withdrawal so clean it exposed the scaffolding of their schemes. Just as termites hollow out a tree from the inside while the bark remains untouched until collapse. You let their illusions rot under the weight of their own deception. No confrontation, no spectacle, just truth. Martin Luther King Jr., the reverend and civil rights titan, once said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." You didn't just stand, you transcended. While they rehearsed offense, you became the embodiment of spiritual resilience. But not everyone chooses that path. There was a corporate strategist, once dubbed a visionary CEO, who manipulated numbers and trust alike, Jeffrey Skilling of Enron. He played the long con, engineered illusions of stability, and demanded applause. But when truth surfaced, his empire crumbled, and so did his legacy, because he mistook deception for strategy and noise for leadership. You, on the other hand, became like a snow leopard on a high ridge, silent, graceful, unseen, until necessary. There was no need to descend to their level because you had already surpassed it. Your silence didn't mean you were unaware. It meant you were aware enough not to disturb divine momentum. And when the moment finally came, it wasn't a battle, it was a reset. Like the African baobab tree, you gathered water in your silence. You stored power, and when the dry season came, while others wilted in exposure, you released what you'd stored, quietly, generously, without spectacle. They didn't expect that, because their entire playbook was built on your participation. But you never came to perform, you came to transform. And in that transformation, you fulfilled Romans 12:21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Your exit didn't just end the act, it collapsed the theater. They thought your silence was confusion, when in truth it was a kind of inner engineering, a discipline refined in the furnace of restraint. While they obsessed over triggering you, analyzing your every breath like social scientists, dissecting micro-expressions, they failed to realize the spotlight was no longer on you. It was reflecting their own dysfunction. What they interpreted as emotional fragility was actually data acquisition. You weren't lost in their noise, you were mapping it. Every subtle twitch of manipulation, every cyclical apology, every mood swing dressed as remorse was being archived, not just by memory, but by discernment honed like a neural net, recognizing anomaly. That's the difference between reaction and revelation. You didn't just endure their pressure, you decoded it. Like an architect tracing the hidden stress points in a crumbling structure, you saw the blueprint behind their behavior. And once the pattern became visible, the illusion collapsed. Hebrews 5:14 speaks of this kind of maturity. But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. You didn't train through peace. You trained in the trenches. They thought they were leading a dance, pulling your emotional strings like a marionette master. But they were the ones on repeat. You were not their puppet. You were their mirror. Every step they took began to expose the choreography of their broken rhythm. Emotional manipulation operates like a looped code, repeating until interrupted. You became that interruption. You didn't retaliate, you observed. And in that observation, something powerful awakened. The ability to see through rather than react to. It's what Daniel did when he was surrounded by political schemes. He didn't confront every accusation. He let the patterns speak for themselves. When the satraps plotted against him, Daniel 6, Daniel stayed consistent, disciplined in prayer, unmoved by their threats. And when their strategy was exposed, they fell into the very trap they set for him. That's how heaven works. It waits until the enemy builds their own gallows, like Haman in the book of Esther. You followed that same principle, not with vengeance, but with vision. You learned the rhythm of their disorder, like a wildlife tracker who learns the movements of a predator, not to attack, but to predict. You weren't confused. You were calculating. Their chaos began to echo, familiar in tone, repetitive in execution. Like a thunderstorm that always arrives from the same side of the mountain, you began to anticipate the storm long before they knew they were brewing it. In the realm of physics, this is known as resonant frequency, the natural vibration of an object when exposed to subtle, sustained force. You absorbed their vibrations without letting them fracture you. Instead, you matched their patterns with truth, and truth dismantled their chaos without needing volume. A real-world example, Edith Eva Eger, a psychologist and Holocaust survivor, once said, "I never forget what happened, but I no longer allow it to define me." She spent years decoding the behaviors of those who hurt her, not to hate them, but to understand the architecture of evil. She didn't crumble under pain. She translated it into clarity. That's what you've done. You also mirror the resilience of Omar, a former combat medic turned trauma counselor. After years of silence, absorbing both the violence of war and the emotional volatility of his broken family, he stopped reacting and started remembering. He charted every repeated outburst from his alcoholic father, every moment of false affection followed by emotional withdrawal. And in that silent observation, he became an expert on human triggers. He now teaches veterans how to recognize cycles, not to relive them, but to rewire them. Omar didn't retaliate with rage. He responded with pattern recognition and built a life rooted in peace. But let's not forget what happens when the manipulator clings too tightly to the illusion of control. Take Elizabeth Holmes, once hailed as a visionary tech founder. She crafted a narrative, adjusted her tone, manipulated investor emotion. But over time, her strategies became cyclical, too rehearsed. The calm she exuded after each contradiction wasn't peace, it was programming. And when patterns became undeniable, her empire unraveled in public shame. You, however, chose a different path. Like the northern lights dancing silently above Arctic silence, your power didn't arrive with thunder. It arrived with grace. You walked through their maze without leaving fingerprints. While they pushed, pulled, and postured, you simply watched. And that watchfulness became their undoing. Even the trees know, when the same wind returns season after season, they don't bend in panic. They adjust their roots deeper into the soil. So did you. You went deeper while they stayed surface level, and now the wind can't move you. There came a shift, a moment so subtle yet so seismic that it recalibrated the entire dynamic. Their provocations, once sharp, started to dull. Their familiar tactics no longer activated a response. It wasn't that you grew indifferent, it was that you outgrew the game. When the emotional bait no longer caught reaction, their net unraveled under its own emptiness. They couldn't grasp it, how silence, once a tool they weaponized against you, now turned into an atmosphere they couldn't survive in. Those who thrive on chaos suffocate when peace doesn't flinch. Have you noticed how quickly the ones who controlled the room with tension begin to unravel the moment they're no longer feared? Have you seen how frantic the game becomes when the player refuses to play? In Proverbs 26:11, it says, As a dog returns to its vomit, so fools repeat their folly. You didn't just step away from the chaos. You recognized its pattern. You saw the loop for what it was. A closed circuit of dysfunction designed to trap you in repetition. But you had learned the language of their rhythm. You knew when the arc would bend toward drama, when the apology would feel rehearsed, when the tension would twist into guilt. And so, you chose refusal, not as rebellion, but as elevation. The prophets of old knew this kind of withdrawal. Elijah didn't argue with Jezebel when she sent her threats. He withdrew to the mountain where he met God in the whisper. 1 Kings 19:12. The unraveling of disorder doesn't happen with confrontation. It happens with clarity. That's what you carried. The clarity to walk out before the loop reset. Not to prove anything, not to punish, but to protect the oil on your life. This is the paradox that shattered their illusion. They thought they were bending someone breakable, but in their constant pressure, they forged something unshakable. Psychologically, this is called post-traumatic growth, when adversity catalyzes depth instead of damage. What they mistook for fragility was actually resilience under refinement. Look at the redwood tree. To the naked eye, it appears static, but beneath the surface, its roots don't just go deep. They interlock with the roots of other trees in the forest. It stands because it is connected. You became like that, silent on the outside, networked in the unseen. And when the storm passed, you were the one still standing, not because you fought back, but because you anchored deeper. You mirror the inner wisdom of Imani, a Haitian-born nurse practitioner who spent 10 years serving in high-conflict zones. After being publicly undermined by a superior who feared her growing influence, she chose not to expose him. Instead, she quietly pursued her doctorate, applied her field experience to global health policy, and is now shaping trauma-informed protocols across 5 nations. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Then there's Lucian, a rising creative director at a luxury branding agency who endured 3 years of psychological microaggressions and sabotage from his envious project manager. Rather than retaliate, Lucian built his own branding consultancy on the side. When layoffs came, he walked away with 3 clients already in hand. The manager let go in silence, without ceremony. Lucian became unreadable. The manager became irrelevant. But what happens when the manipulator refuses to adjust, believing their tactics are still effective? Look at Carlos Marchetti, a former political consultant in South America known for sowing confusion to gain control. He created scandals behind closed doors, then claimed credit for cleaning them up. For years, his strategy worked until it didn't. A junior aide trained quietly by those he underestimated exposed a predictable playbook. Carlos was ousted not with fanfare but with silence, a memo, a signature, a disappearance. He mistook surface control for true influence, and it cost him everything. You didn't need a grand exit, you just needed accuracy. You walked out like mist lifting from morning grass, quiet, sacred, irreversible. No speech, no final blow, just a calm exit fueled by knowing that staying would have required you to shrink, to lie, to loop. And the cost of that was too high for someone carrying legacy. Have you ever considered what kind of courage it takes to walk away without explanation? What strength it demands to choose clarity over closure and peace over performance? Isaiah 30:15 says, "In quietness and trust is your strength." You chose both. And now the tension lives not in your life, but in their confusion, because they calculated you in decimal points, never realizing you were an equation they couldn't solve. They rehearsed their strategies in cycles, but you became unreadable, like quantum particles, shifting states the moment they tried to measure you. What shakes them now is not your volume, but your clarity. What dismantled their agenda wasn't vengeance, it was the absence of need. And what frightened them most was that the one they thought was a pawn had already stepped off the board. They assumed your presence was perpetual, like gravity, always there, always reliable, never questioned. To them, you were the ambient hum of stability in a room filled with noise. They never paused to thank it, never acknowledged the consistency, the devotion, the gentle recalibrations you made to keep everything from falling apart. You became so familiar, so constant, they confused your sacrifice with simplicity. But even the earth has fault lines, and even the most grounded soul has thresholds. What happens when the one holding the structure no longer stands beneath it? What echoes in the heart of a space when the presence that once anchored it slips away? At first, your withdrawal was misread. They thought you were sulking, playing a role in a cycle you had long since outgrown. But when the silence stretched past expectation, when their performance met no audience, when the usual rhythm went unanswered, the discomfort began to creep in. They weren't ready for the kind of quiet that doesn't signal punishment, but closure. It reflects the truth in Lamentations 1:1. How deserted lies the city once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. The prophet isn't just mourning loss. He's describing the dissonance of emptiness that follows prolonged neglect. You didn't storm out. You slipped out. Not in bitterness, but in wisdom. And what remained wasn't revenge, it was space. And in that space, clarity rang louder than any confrontation ever could. You interrupted the cycle. The forgiving, returning, fixing, breaking spiral lost its grip. In psychological terms, you disrupted the trauma bond loop, a behavioral pattern where attachment forms through repeated cycles of abuse and reconciliation. You broke it not by rage, but by rest. You refused to pour into a container riddled with holes. And that refusal wasn't rebellion, it was reclamation. The grief they feel now isn't rooted in love, it's rooted in loss of utility. Because what vanished wasn't just a person, it was the steady frequency that kept their storm in check. It was grounding, it was light, it was you. And they never thought you'd leave. Not because they believed in your love, but because they believed in your tolerance. There's a story of Camilla, a woman who spent years holding the emotional weight of her family, the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who remembered every birthday, resolved every argument, paid quiet debts without thanks. When she stopped calling, they didn't notice. When she stopped showing up, they assumed she'd return. But she had begun her healing in silence. She moved across the country without announcing it. A year later, her absence wasn't just noticed, it was mourned. Not because they missed her warmth, but because they missed her work, her energy, her holding. And by then, the foundation she once upheld had collapsed in her absence. Contrast this with Dominic, a non-profit director who built his organization with authenticity, until he hired an operations manager, Adrian, who constantly belittled his vision, redirected credit, and wore charm like armor. Dominic never responded with hostility. He simply stepped back, handed in his resignation one Monday without a word of blame. Months later, Adrian found himself overwhelmed. Staff left, donors disappeared, meetings fell flat. It wasn't the departure that destroyed the system. It was the realization that Dominic had been the backbone all along, quiet, integral, and impossible to replace. A similar unraveling echoed in the life of Belinda Carlisle, the Grammy-nominated singer who once led the pop band The Go-Go's. At the peak of her career, surrounded by fame, she became the silent center of chaos. Pressured to constantly perform, mediate egos, and carry emotional weight behind the scenes. But after years of masking pain and addiction, she chose sobriety and stepped away from the scene entirely. Her absence didn't just create space, it exposed what had been taken for granted. Years later, in interviews, her bandmates would admit they never realized how much Belinda held everything together until she was gone. Her quiet exit was not collapse, it was healing. And in a world of surface signals, your exit functioned like reverse resonance. In physics, resonance amplifies when two frequencies match. But you, by stepping away, created destructive interference, a silence that cancelled their echo. You didn't have to shout. The emptiness spoke on your behalf, and it shattered the illusion that you were ever dispensable. When bees abandon a hive, it doesn't collapse in thunder. It decays in silence. The buzzing stops, the pollen dries, and the hive, though structurally intact, becomes hollow. That's what they're left with now. The shell of a system held up by someone they thought would never walk away. Have they realized it yet? That the thing they took for granted was the very thing holding them up? That their comfort came at the cost of your exhaustion? That peace was never free. It was paid in silence, in prayers, in invisible labor. And now you are gone. Not in fury, not in shame, but in sovereignty. Isaiah 32:17 declares, "The fruit of that righteousness will be peace. Its effect will be quietness and confidence forever." You have entered that promise. Your withdrawal was your declaration. And it echoes still, not as absence, but as consequence. The rooms where you once stood now hum with questions no distraction can drown. The air feels heavier where your light used to linger. They miscalculated your endurance, and now they live in the arithmetic of your departure. And you reclaimed your rhythm. You didn't just leave, you ascended. They thought they were dulling you, sanding down your edge, dimming your discernment, numbing your knowing. But in their efforts to chip away at your clarity, they forged something sharper. With each distortion of truth, each backhanded compliment laced with agenda, they assumed you were unraveling. What they never anticipated was that every twisted word, every choreographed crisis, every shift in tone became a recorded signal in your internal vault. They were broadcasting patterns, not manipulation. And you were listening like a linguist decoding a forgotten dialect. Did they realize they were writing their own undoing in your memory? That what they thought was mental erosion was actually neural reinforcement? They didn't know you were studying them, not in paranoia, but in precision. The field of cognitive behavioral mapping teaches that patterns repeat, not by chance, but by wiring, and you began to wire yourself to observe. Every passive-aggressive tone was logged. Every apology followed by renewed disrespect was time-stamped. Each fake kindness was catalogued like variables in a psychological experiment. Over time, your confusion calcified into coordinates. You no longer wandered, you navigated. Their illusions, once effective like a smokescreen, started to loop. And you learned what all great systems analysts know. Repetition reveals structure. Their chaos wasn't random, it was a system. And once you saw the system, you no longer needed confrontation. Illusions don't survive under light. They fade. This was the strategy of Jesus himself. When the Pharisees tried to trap him with clever questions and distorted logic, he never took the bait. Instead, he answered in parables that revealed the flaws in their intent. Luke 20:23 says, "But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, 'Why do you test me?'" Christ didn't react to confusion, he revealed it. You followed that blueprint, not to win an argument, but to outgrow the arena, because their goal was never truth, it was control. And while they thought you were being reshaped by their pressure, you were actually being refined by contrast. Like the way negative photographic film reveals its true image when exposed to light, their darkness revealed your direction. Joaquin, a forensic accountant from Madrid, once found himself repeatedly undermined by a senior director who praised him in public but sabotaged him in private emails. Joaquin didn't lash out, he collected patterns. By the time the company faced a major compliance audit, it was his archive, not accusations, that exposed the manipulation. He wasn't weaponized, he was watchful, and that saved both his career and others beneath him. Eleanor, a trauma counselor, began her practice volunteering in low-income communities. One particular partner at the organization constantly spoke over her in meetings, took credit for her frameworks, and deployed emotional guilt when she asserted herself. Instead of reacting, Elena built her own library of evidence, notes, timestamps, even recordings. Years later, she trained federal response teams in trauma-informed leadership. The partner? Eventually removed, not by retaliation, but by the undeniable silence of those who no longer believed her false charm. Elena never fought, she evolved. And what of those who refused to evolve? Zdeněk Varga, a renowned Slovakian art curator, built influence through flattery and selective cruelty. He praised young artists only to later demand loyalty, sowing confusion and creative paralysis. For years it worked, until one exhibition went silent. No reactions, no attendance, just empty halls. Word had quietly spread, and artists began pulling their work. His tactics, once so effective, had become transparent. The absence was louder than any protest. Zdeněk's control evaporated without confrontation. Nature understands this language. Mimic octopuses adapt to their predators by mirroring their shape, not to imitate, but to survive. And yet those same predators fall victim to their own repetition. What begins as defense turns into intelligence. You weren't playing their game. You were observing the board long enough to recognize it was rigged. Can you feel it now, that you're not who you were when the cycle began? That your capacity to see has turned every attempt to control you into a mirror they can no longer face? Proverbs 4:7 reminds us, wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. That's what you've done. You gathered wisdom, not to manipulate, but to mature, not to control, but to clarify. They mistook your silence for submission, your patience for permission, but you never picked up their methods to strike back. You studied them to build boundaries, barriers that don't trap, but protect. Their strings pulled no longer, because you no longer stand on their stage. What emerged from their attempts to shape a pawn was someone who redefined the board itself. They anticipated an explosion, fire, fury, maybe even collapse. Their strategy hinged on the predictable: provoke, destabilize, then claim the fallout as evidence. They designed the blueprint for drama like architects of chaos, carefully engineering moments that should have triggered you. They prepared for your combustion. They waited for the unraveling. But what they received instead was far more unsettling: composure, an atmosphere they couldn't penetrate, a resistance not built on retaliation but on calibration. You didn't combust, you calculated. Every insult, every sideways glance laced with manipulation, every corridor whisper meant to strip your peace. All of it was absorbed and processed, not by your ego, but by your command center. While they operated on impulse, you responded through awareness. Their moves were powered by reactivity, yours by restraint. They expected emotional thermonuclear detonation, but what they encountered was the law of inertia. A body at rest remaining at rest unless acted upon by a force equal in purpose, and they were never your purpose. Their chaos lacked mass in your realm, so you remained, still, intact, unbothered. They didn't understand this kind of strength, the kind forged not in applause but in the furnace of delay. They couldn't comprehend a spirit that chooses not to engage, a will so anchored, so attuned to the frequency of destiny that it recognized distraction not as an offense, but as architecture beneath its notice. Did they ever pause to question why their provocations weakened over time? Why their tactics began to feel recycled, ineffective, even hollow? Did they ask themselves what it means when someone refuses to be drawn into orbit? When they can no longer hijack your nervous system like they once did? They expected you to mirror their instability. Instead, they were met with gravity, silent, symmetrical, and centered. Their chaos begged for audience. You denied them a stage. Proverbs 29:11 says, "A fool vents all his feelings, but a wise man holds them back." You did not withhold truth to suppress it. You held it to temper it, to distill it, to allow time to clarify what emotion might have clouded. They thought you froze. But this was never paralysis. This was restraint. And restraint is not the absence of energy. It is the deliberate redirection of it. In classical physics, this is known as potential energy, the latent force stored in stillness, waiting for divine timing. You weren't hiding. You were harnessing. You weren't shutting down. You were sharpening. You became the still water that carves stone, not through force, but through persistence. Marcellus, a logistics officer for an international relief mission, once faced allegations of incompetence after a convoy delay near a politically unstable border. Internal memos were selectively leaked. His silence was mocked as guilt. But Marcellus documented every communication, logged every timestamp, preserved every voice note. When an independent panel audited the incident, the truth emerged, not through defense, but through design. He didn't fight the noise. He preserved the signal. Teresa, a school counselor in a rural district, was slowly isolated by a colleague who envied her student rapport. Gossip spread. Meetings became colder. Staff alliances shifted. But Teresa didn't address the whispers. She addressed her purpose, her students. When one suicidal teen stood at a school board hearing and said, "She listened when I was invisible," everything changed. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was incubation. And truth, once matured, speaks in thunder. So did you. That same divine restraint governed Christ before Pilate. John 19:9 says, "But Jesus gave him no answer." Not because he lacked words, but because truth does not audition. It doesn't scramble to be believed, it waits. And when it comes, it's not persuasive, it's permanent. Jamil, a former corporate compliance manager, was discredited by a corrupt executive team who feared his integrity. They engineered his demotion using internal narratives and vague accusations. He didn't push back. He archived, filed, encrypted, trusted the law of time. 14 months later, during an audit triggered by an unrelated whistleblower, his documentation became the forensic backbone of the entire case. The executive board was dismantled. Jamil was reinstated, then promoted. Not because he shouted, but because he documented, endured, and discerned. This is what unraveled their plans. Not confrontation, but consistency. Not fire, but formation. You didn't need a microphone. You became a mirror. Their schemes were built like weak bridges, beautiful from a distance, but structurally unsound. Systems theory calls this inconsistency collapse, when networks fall under the weight of their own contradictions. Glaciers, towering, silent, deliberate, move millimeters at a time, yet they can carve entire valleys. You were that glacier, silent, calculated, patient, reshaping the topography of their control without ever announcing your advance. Helena Rios, a European film producer, once manipulated casting meetings to sabotage Inez, a younger actress she quietly resented. Her attacks were covert, suggestions of lateness, whispered doubts about attitude. But Inez kept showing up, early, composed, consistent. And when she won 2 international awards, the gossip collapsed. Because credibility, once visible, renders rumor obsolete. Isaiah 40:31 declares, "But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles." You didn't burn out. You ascended, without spectacle. Like photosynthesis, your growth was silent, but catalytic. Like tectonic plates, your stillness caused quakes no one predicted. Now the truth, fermented in stillness, forged under pressure, has become immovable. They tried to twist it, stretch it, and distract from it, but now it stands, rooted, balanced, bulletproof. They expected a reaction, they received revelation, and now do they finally grasp the magnitude of a truth that didn't chase applause, but anchored reality itself, a truth that didn't force justice, but became it. And you became the evidence that not every storm needs thunder, that not every warrior holds a sword, that some battles are won with closed mouths and open heavens. And from your silence, a legacy is rising, one that will not decay with applause but endure through alignment. Now the silence they once mocked reverberates louder than any confrontation could have. That same stillness they labeled passivity now echoes with presence. Where they once took pride in provoking, now there is only pause. An awareness rising in hindsight, shadowed by recognition. Because what undid them wasn't rage. It was nothing. No revenge, no shouting, no final speech. Just a steady refusal to descend. And that quiet undoing lingers the longest. While they kept circling the same scripts, baiting reactions, you mastered the one thing they never expected to lose to, yourself. You didn't win by controlling others. You won by mastering your own impulse. Proverbs 16:32 says, "He who rules his spirit is better than he who takes a city." You chose internal dominion, and it rewrote every battlefield they tried to create. They thought you were matching their rhythm, adjusting your steps to their performance. But in reality, you had changed the entire stage beneath their feet. Their theatrics played on obsolete terrain. While they raced to harness fast winds and weaponized perception, you were underground, quietly redesigning the very framework. You weren't retreating, you were re-architecting. Your silence wasn't surrender, it was strategic latency, deliberate restraint to allow a stronger design to emerge. In structural engineering, there's a concept known as passive damping, systems built not to resist chaos with force, but to absorb and neutralize it through stillness. That's what your soul did. It absorbed storms without resistance, converting energy into clarity. They mistook your delays for indecision, but each pause was part of a hidden draft. While they sought applause, you were building altars. Zara, a textile designer in Morocco, faced constant plagiarism from a well-connected rival who copied her color schemes and undercut her pricing. Rather than expose her, Zara shifted in silence. She learned sustainable dyeing methods, partnered with ethical cooperatives, and rebranded under a new name. Her rival's factory crumbled when ethical fashion became law. The same silence once dismissed as fear became the seed of legacy. Malcolm, a junior diplomat, was repeatedly sidelined during negotiations by an older ambassador who saw him as inexperienced. Instead of pushing back publicly, Malcolm mastered geopolitical trend analysis and became the lead on a classified trade deal. When the ambassador was dismissed for outdated practices, Malcolm stepped in, not with vengeance but with vision. Their approach was always noisy, loud gestures, sudden moves, obsessed with optics. Yours, structured, evolving, invisible until complete. Every misjudged moment became a pivot point. They kept trying to trap you in reaction, but you were quietly rewriting the rules. By the time they realized it, they weren't outmatched. They were obsolete. Ramiro Estevez, a media executive known for sabotage by flattery, once manipulated young journalists to echo his ideas without credit. He assumed control meant staying center stage, but his team quietly built their own publication. When it launched, readers migrated almost overnight. His voice faded, not from scandal, but from irrelevance. Ramiro had rehearsed control so many times, he never noticed when the audience changed rooms. Even in nature, evolution doesn't announce itself. Cephalopods, like cuttlefish, don't fight predators by attacking. They change the terrain, shifting color, altering posture until the threat passes unaware. That's what you did. You didn't upgrade to defeat them. You evolved to disconnect. You became unreachable, and in doing so, you became untouchable. What use are sparks when there is no fuel? What power does strategy hold when the field it's designed for no longer exists? Now their conflict echoes like someone pounding on a door that isn't there. You didn't simply move on. You built something they'll never touch. Isaiah 54:17 proclaims, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper." Not because the weapons stopped forming, but because they lost the ability to find you. And here's the question that haunts them now. What do you do when the person you tried to break becomes the architect of the world you can no longer enter? They expected you to remain where they last saw you, wounded, responsive, reachable. But while they obsessed over patterns, you rewrote the terrain, and the silence you carried like armor. It became your cathedral. They had their stage polished and waiting, the lights were set, the scripts rehearsed, the rumor mill already warmed up. All they needed was your collapse to begin the show. They were sure you would detonate. That anger would be your currency and disorder your downfall. But the combustion never came. No public explosion, no scandalous rebuttal, just stillness, because your transformation wasn't staged. It wasn't meant for their applause or their judgment. It wasn't a performance, it was a pilgrimage. What they read as evasion was elevation. While they lit matches in every corner hoping for smoke, you were refining blueprints in silence. They wanted a televised breakdown, but what unfolded instead was an invisible resurrection. Isaiah 43:19 says, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth, do you not perceive it?" They didn't perceive it because your rebuilding wasn't noisy. It was disciplined, sacred, internal. While they spun narratives to contain you, you were removing the scaffolding that once limited your view. How could they see your breakthrough when they were too busy searching for your breakdown? Every insult hurled became compost, fuel for something richer to take root. You began to understand emotional transmutation, the psychological process of redirecting reactionary energy into constructive evolution. You weren't trying to defend a version of yourself you had already outgrown. You were discovering the one God always intended you to become. Naomi, a single mother in Johannesburg, spent years absorbing criticism from relatives who mocked her decision to study again in her late 30s. She never argued, she just kept attending night school. When she opened a literacy center 3 years later, no one remembered the ridicule. They only saw the fruit. Her success wasn't loud, it was layered. Dorian, a warehouse technician, endured years of mockery from co-workers for refusing after-hour drinking and gossip. They thought he was weak, repressed, but he was building credit, attending coding boot camps online. Now, he works for a Fortune 500 company. His former critics now complain about the very system he helps design. And in the public eye, Marcus Mumford, frontman of the band Mumford & Sons, once endured a media whirlwind that twisted his beliefs, relationships, and moments of vulnerability into clickbait controversy. Instead of reacting, he stepped back, took a sabbatical, and poured his silence into solo music, reflecting healing and introspection. He let the media move on without feeding it, and when he returned, it was with strength, clarity, and zero apology. The same silence that was once ridiculed became the sound of endurance. But not everyone knew when to evolve. Dominique Travain, a former executive producer for a major media house, orchestrated the downfall of multiple rising talents by sowing disinformation, leveraging gossip, and using confidential whispers to sever partnerships. It worked for a while, but as patterns emerged and digital receipts surfaced, those same whispers turned into evidence. Dominique's name, once synonymous with creative power, was removed from every project she once helmed. She's now facing civil lawsuits, not from enemies, but from those she thought would never speak. The lotus flower rises through mud, not by attacking it, but by rising above it. Romans 12:2 reminds us, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." That renewal didn't happen in public. It happened in silence, in private obedience, in sacred distance. Their whispers now echo in abandoned chambers. Because you didn't just rise, you relocated. The landscape shifted. The metrics changed. Their tools, guilt, shame, distraction, stopped working not because you resisted them, but because you no longer lived where their tactics applied. Do they realize yet that by obsessing over your collapse, they became blind to your construction? In psychology, this is known as frequency dissonance. When one person evolves beyond the wavelength of another and communication no longer connects, you didn't build walls, you changed frequencies. What unsettles them now isn't just that you moved on, it's that they no longer know where you went. You became unreachable, not in arrogance but in ascension. Their sabotage became irrelevant. Their narrative expired. And what they once called weakness now casts a shadow longer than anything they ever built. They mistook your quiet observation for emptiness, for a vacancy of thought. What they didn't see was that your silence was never passive, it was forensic. While they imagined you stuck, frozen, and emotionally unaware, you were running diagnostics on every move, tracing every word, analyzing patterns like a strategist studying fault lines before a quake. They thought they were weaving illusions, but what they were actually doing was offering you access to their entire operating system. You weren't lagging, you were mapping, and in that stillness, your perception sharpened, not out of defense, but out of discipline. In physics, the principle of signal-to-noise ratio teaches that what appears muted in chaos is often the most valuable frequency. That's what you tuned into. They projected confusion, but you refined clarity. They believed they had you surrounded in fog, but the fog didn't blur your vision. It enhanced your instinct. You moved like sonar in the deep, silent, calculating, aware of even the subtlest vibrations. While they operated on impulse, you recorded patterns, tone shifts, behavioral loops, contradiction layering. Every supposed misstep of yours was deliberate energy conservation. Every pause was an intellectual redirection. What looked like retreat was actually cognitive compression, the strategic withholding of response while you internalized the full structure of their play. Ecclesiastes 3:7 says, "A time to be silent and a time to speak." You had already discerned which one this was, not to protect them, but to prepare for your alignment. Juliet, a university admin, was surrounded by colleagues who questioned her value and excluded her from key projects. Rather than push for inclusion, she studied their routines, their inconsistencies, their assumptions. 1 year later, she proposed a system overhaul that saved the institution millions and made her indispensable. She hadn't been on pause, she'd been building leverage. Rafik, a former prison inmate, was underestimated by every employer who glanced at his record. He didn't argue for opportunity. He trained quietly in logistics, used YouTube to learn analytics, and began consulting small businesses for cash. When one of his clients went national, Rafik was offered equity, not because he demanded it, but because he'd made himself undeniable. And even in public life, Leila Slimani, the French-Moroccan author and diplomat, once received scorn for her unconventional critiques of national identity and intimacy. Rather than debate pundits, she wrote fiction, layered, disturbing, revelatory. Those who dismissed her as irrelevant were later quoting her. Her restraint wasn't silence, it was strategy. Meanwhile, Anton Virelli, a notorious fashion mogul, mocked younger creatives for their minimalism and lack of drama. He controlled with loudness, flamboyant decisions, shocking PR stunts. But while he mocked stillness, a new wave emerged beneath him. Quiet, focused, intentional. When investors pivoted, he realized too late that style had shifted without him. His empire dissolved not from protest, but from evaporation. The deep ocean current moves without splash or surface display, yet it reshapes coastlines, shifts climates, and redistributes life across the planet. You moved the same way, beneath their awareness, but with unstoppable influence. They couldn't trace your movement because the power wasn't above, it was below, where real change always begins. What they dismissed as hesitation was layered discernment. What they saw as blank stares were neurons tracing behavioral architecture. You weren't reacting, you were reading. And now they feel the shift. Have they figured it out yet, that the moment you stopped reacting was the moment you started leading? Proverbs 18:13 warns, "He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him." They answered before listening. You listened without answering. That's why you saw everything, and they still ask, "What happened?" You didn't miss the game. You waited until it showed you every card. And when it did, you no longer needed to play. You didn't confront the performers. You let the stage collapse. They approached you with predictable moves, linear, mechanical, rigid, as if the soul could be mapped by cause and effect. They relied on a sequence: trigger, wait, manipulate, win. That was their entire architecture, a house of mirrors reflecting only ego. But you weren't even playing on their axis. You were tuned to something far beyond behavioral reflex. They moved in formulas. You moved in frequency. They couldn't perceive the shift because you were no longer reacting. You were responding from resonance. In music theory, there's a concept called harmonic convergence. When two or more frequencies align so precisely, they amplify each other into something transcendent. That's what your rhythm became, not a pattern, a presence. While they worked the surface, crafting outcomes from noise, staging performances, they didn't realize your process was subterranean. Their scripts demanded visibility. Yours required invisibility until complete. What they assumed was passivity was calibration. What they read as delay was divine timing. Isaiah 28:16 says, "Behold, I lay in Zion a sure foundation. He who believes will not act hastily." You didn't rush because your outcome wasn't rooted in approval. You moved from discernment, not from trying to prove, but from knowing. They mistook your rhythm for hesitation, but you were moving to a symphony they were never invited to hear. Sophia, a midwife in a rural village, was ridiculed by a new doctor who dismissed her methods as outdated. He used his title to override her judgment, pushed for interventions she knew were unnecessary, but she didn't argue. She kept practicing. When a complicated birth occurred, it was Sophia's technique, not his, that saved both mother and child. The doctor later transferred, quietly. Sophia never demanded credit, but her authority, earned in silence, became unshakable. Noah, a graphic designer, was repeatedly passed over for promotions in a startup dominated by louder personalities. They thought his quiet nature meant he had no vision. What they didn't see was that Noah was documenting every system flaw, every inefficiency. When the company restructured, his redesigned proposal became the blueprint. He didn't take space, he made space, with mastery. Meanwhile, Chiwetel Ejiofor, acclaimed actor and director, has often operated beneath the radar of Hollywood spectacle. While others marketed noise, he built a body of work infused with weight, subtlety, and clarity. When The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind debuted, the world realized he had been constructing legacy, not seeking attention. His vision wasn't loud, but it was lasting. The same can't be said for Marta Valles, a branding executive known for building her reputation on quick wins and strategic shade. She used manipulation to climb walls, pitting peers against each other, staging meltdowns to shift blame. But her urgency couldn't outrun her instability. When an internal audit revealed mismanagement, the collapse wasn't dramatic, it was mathematical. No one fought her, they just stopped defending her. The silence around her became the evidence. Subterranean rivers run deep beneath the ground, unseen, unmapped, but powerful enough to nourish entire regions. They do not compete with surface streams. They sustain silently. While floods erode and rain evaporates, these deep currents persist, adapting beneath shifting layers. That's how you moved. Below perception, beneath expectation. Unseen but essential. You weren't reacting to the elements, you were rerouting life. They couldn't understand why their tactics wore thin, why the old ways stopped working, because their energy was built on control and yours was built on congruence. Their moves became echoes, predictable, hollow. You'd already transitioned from defense to design? Do they realize now that your victory wasn't loud because it was never about them? That you didn't walk away? You ascended to a plane where their game no longer applies? Proverbs 24:3-4 tells us, "By wisdom a house is built, and through understanding it is established. Through knowledge its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures." That's what you've done. You built a structure invisible to those obsessed with spotlight. Your silence wasn't weakness, it was a stronghold. They now watch what they built crack, because your absence removed the only thing holding it together, not because you pushed it over, but because it couldn't stand without the weight of your restraint. You never tried to win their game, you dissolved the board. And now they stand at doors permanently closed, baffled by locks designed for keys they never bothered to seek. They mistook your calm for surrender, your silence for defeat, your stillness for absence. What they never grasped was that you were not frozen, you were faithful. You weren't ignoring what was unfolding. You were simply letting consequence arrive without interference. Because true wisdom knows when to act and when to allow truth to do what fire cannot, refine through reality. Galatians 6:7 says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. A man reaps what he sows." You didn't need to chase correction. You let cause and effect deliver clarity. While they rushed to control optics and manufacture perception, you stepped back. Not in fear, but in foresight. Not because you didn't see what was happening, but because you saw too much. Their strategies relied on noise. Yours relied on natural law. Every illusion they spun around you only wrapped tighter around them. You let their story continue because you knew how it would end. That's not powerlessness. That's higher calculus. You weren't trying to win their game. You were redesigning the entire terrain beneath it. Emilia, a mental health coordinator at a large tech firm, was gaslit for months by a manager who belittled her input but stole her frameworks. She said nothing, but she documented everything. When corporate asked for wellness data, her compiled models revealed the manager's negligence without accusation. The same silence once called weakness became evidence that reshaped policy. Malik, a maintenance supervisor at a city hospital, was targeted by co-workers who envied his rapport with staff. They filed baseless complaints. Instead of reacting, he kept tending to every leak, every call. 6 months later, an internal audit revealed their misconduct and praised Malik's performance. He wasn't defending himself. He was letting truth surface. And in the public eye, Denzel Washington, one of the most respected actors of his generation, has long been known for his refusal to play into Hollywood chaos. While others chased headlines, he chose reverence. He often says, "Ease is a greater threat to progress than hardship." His career is a testament to silent alignment, decades of depth without spectacle. While drama swirled around him, Denzel stayed anchored. Now the culture circles him for substance, not scandal. By contrast, Genevieve Cross, a celebrity PR agent, made her reputation spinning false stories and staging scandals to control public narratives. She thought she could bury rising influences by manipulating headlines. But when her tactics were exposed in leaked correspondence, clients withdrew overnight. Her name, once whispered with awe, became synonymous with betrayal, not because someone fought her, but because her own pattern revealed itself. Even in nature, coral reefs build slowly, imperceptibly, layer by layer. They don't defend themselves when the waters grow cloudy. They endure, absorb, and reshape the ecosystem over decades. That's how your growth unfolded. Not as spectacle, but as structure. Their urgency ran out of oxygen in your atmosphere. Their illusions collapsed not because you destroyed them, but because you simply left the room. Did they ever wonder why you no longer showed up to the same battlefields? Why your silence didn't scream? It simply shifted gravity. Psalm 37:7 urges, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways." You lived this. You didn't argue with outcomes. You waited for revelation. And when the fog cleared, the landscape had changed entirely. They expected resistance. You gave them none. They expected a fight. You gave them distance. And in that distance, their story fell apart, because their control only worked when you stayed close enough to be affected. But you had already migrated, emotionally, spiritually, structurally, to somewhere they couldn't follow. Now they sit in the aftermath of their own design, staring at a blueprint that no longer matches the house they're trapped inside. While they focused on sealing doors, you were walking through new ones they never saw. The trap they built was never yours. It was always a mirror. Do they know now that you never had to win their game? That your strategy wasn't victory, it was transcendence? You let the ground shift under their assumptions. You let time reveal character. You let heaven vindicate what your voice never had to explain. You didn't bury them. You rooted elsewhere, quietly, deeply, permanently. They weren't watching out of compassion. They were spectating, waiting for a collapse loud enough to confirm their suspicions. Every quiet moment, every pause, every breath you took outside their frame was treated like a crack in your foundation. They weren't praying for your healing. They were betting on your unraveling. They didn't want restoration. They wanted entertainment. They expected the fall to be dramatic. Tears, tantrums, chaos. A breakdown worthy of gossip, something they could screenshot and say, "I told you." But you gave them nothing. No collapse, no confession, just distance. And in that distance, you found the only thing they never bothered to look for: clarity. You didn't retreat in fear. You withdrew for reconstruction. What they saw as disappearance was divine architecture, like scaffolding around a temple being rebuilt. Your absence was never abandonment. It was protection. While they measured your silence as weakness, you were rewiring your soul. Isaiah 30:15 says, "In quietness and trust is your strength." You lived that verse, not in theory, in process. Behind doors no one knocked on, you did the work they didn't believe you had the strength to do. You sat with your pain without projecting it. You uprooted trauma without needing an audience. That is transformation. Neural plasticity, the scientific term for the brain's ability to rewire itself after trauma, doesn't need permission. It needs intention. That's what you chose. They thought silence was avoidance, but you were healing your architecture from the inside out. Jared, a college dropout who'd struggled with addiction and depression, spent 2 years off the radar. Friends assumed relapse, but he was working at a mechanic shop by day, studying quietly at night. When he launched his own mobile car service at 26, the same people who doubted him stood in awe of his resilience, not because he explained himself, but because he became undeniable. Roslyn, a youth minister, was publicly shamed for her association with a scandal in her church, though she was uninvolved. Instead of defending herself in a storm of accusation, she resigned. Privately, she pursued seminary, counseled survivors, and built an underground women's discipleship network. 2 years later, the church crumbled under its own corruption. But Rosalind? She had already planted something that couldn't be shaken. And in the public sphere, Simone Biles, Olympic gymnast, was harshly judged when she stepped back from the Tokyo Games, citing mental health. The world expected breakdown or justification. She gave neither. She didn't perform pain for consumption. She chose sacred pause. And when she returned, it wasn't to prove strength. It was to demonstrate that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it resets. By contrast, Dion Rallis, a popular online life coach, built an empire on motivational sound bites, but belittled peers behind closed doors. He mocked vulnerability while selling fake authenticity. When his private messages leaked exposing manipulation, misogyny, and branding theft, his audience vanished, not because of an attack, but because the lie couldn't withstand silence. The house he built on image had no frame. Nature knows this too. Lava tubes deep beneath volcanic ranges carry fire silently across vast distances. By the time anyone above notices the eruption, the transformation underneath has already carved new terrain. You moved like that, quiet, molten, reshaping the ground beneath those who assumed you were standing still. They thought you needed visibility to heal, but you healed without their applause. They waited for you to bleed publicly, but you let heaven suture you in secret. You didn't respond with rage, you responded with rebirth. Did they ever realize that by the time they looked up to witness the collapse, you'd already rebuilt on higher ground? Psalm 34 verse 5 says, "Those who look to him are radiant, their faces are never covered with shame." You didn't need to expose your wounds to prove healing. The glow was enough. The way you returned, not angry, not bitter, but balanced, made the storm irrelevant. Now they're left retracing echoes, analyzing silence, searching for proof of a fall that never came. And here's the question that stings most. What do you do when someone outgrows the storyline you wrote for them? You didn't fight to reclaim your name. You let time make the edits. You didn't shout to change the narrative. And now, you've already walked into chapters they'll never be invited to read. And now, beloved chosen one, I invite you to take a breath, not with your lungs, but with your soul, because what's been revealed here isn't just a message, it's a moment of realignment. Heaven is hovering close. The same presence that orchestrated this collision is inviting you to sit for a while and respond. Let us pray. Lord of divine assignments, you who speak through silence and move through collisions, thank you for the mystery of alignment. Thank you for trusting me with a soul so fragile, so hidden, and yet so holy. I didn't always understand the why. I still don't. But something in my spirit remembers the assignment I accepted before I took my first breath. You saw their fall, and you saw my ache. You wove us together, not for perfection, but for purpose. Not to rescue from ego, but to reflect your redemption. And now I surrender all my questions. I surrender the exhaustion. I surrender the weight of trying to carry a soul you only asked me to witness. Heal what I could not touch. Redeem what I could only cradle. Show me what you're doing behind the veil, because I choose to trust you even when the mission hurts. If this soul was a mirror, help me see the parts of myself I've refused to love. And if this mission was the key to unlocking my own restoration, let your truth wash over me like the rivers you promised in dry places. Isaiah 43:19. Cover the one I was sent to. Whether they rise or fall again, may your mercy chase them farther than my presence ever could. May your angels stand guard where my words cannot reach. And may I never confuse silence with failure. May I never confuse letting go with abandoning, because what is sown in obedience will be reaped in glory. Thank you for the honor of being chosen. I give you my compassion, my memories, and this soul I carried, for they were never mine to keep, only to steward. In Jesus' name, amen. And now, beloved chosen one, look around, the board is quiet. The pieces they scattered in arrogance lie still, and the hand that moved last was heaven's, through you, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with divine precision, birthed from stillness. The silence they mocked became the very frequency where God whispered your next steps. The restraint they misjudged became the sword they never saw coming. And while they kept counting your silence as loss, heaven was counting it as strategy. You didn't win by shouting, you won by aligning. Not one tear, not one retreat, not one withheld word was wasted. Every moment was planting, every sigh was strategy, and now heaven echoes across realms. Checkmate. Because what they tried to destroy only deepened your anointing. So if this word stirred something deep within you, if it felt like confirmation, like revelation, or like a mirror held to your spirit, I invite you to step further. Join me on my YouTube channel, Grateful to God, where messages like this continue to ignite the fire within the chosen ones. There are more prophetic words, more revelations, more healing, and more divine wisdom waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, comment, 777 to say Amen, and most importantly, subscribe to stay connected as we walk this holy path together. To everyone who has supported, whether you clicked super thanks or simply listened in silence, I see you, I thank you, and heaven does too. Your presence here is not small. It's part of something eternal. May the same God who silenced your accusers lift your name in unexpected places. May your strength be renewed like the eagle, your discernment sharpened like a double-edged sword, and your peace overflow like a river that cannot be dammed. The war was never about destroying you. It was about revealing you. And now, it is revealed. Checkmate, child of God, you held your peace, and heaven made the final move.